the whole point is that they created this educational structure built around an idea that inherently and unavoidably produces anti-Semitism. And that structure has to be changed if you want the culture on campus to change. Some people say, well, Jews should just be added to the DEI script. But
right, that was like that petition in Hollywood.
Yeah, it can't happen. They're mutually exclusive.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines.
Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States with a conversation about the state of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the presidential contest with Commentary Magazine's senior editor, Seth Mandel. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribing. And now to today's program. Is America still a great power? In terms of economic and military strength, the answer is, of course, still yes. But if we're defining the term by discussing the will to exercise that power on behalf of its own interests, or that of its allies, or whether it is still a society with a belief in the values of Western civilization and in the exceptionalism of the American model of democracy that allowed it to be great, then maybe the answer is very much in doubt. The Biden administration's incompetence in foreign policy has led to disaster in Afghanistan, failed appeasement of Iran, the Ukraine quagmire, and now a disgraceful unwillingness to fully support Israel's efforts to eradicate Hamas. By seeking to prevent Israel from winning the war that was forced upon it by the atrocities of October 7th, President Joe Biden is doing great harm to American interests in the region as well as undermining Israel's security. But the explanation for this goes deeper than just an aging leader who hasn't the backbone to stand up to either his leftist base or a coterie of advisors who, like the president, has learned nothing from the events of the last 30 years in the Middle East. Even worse, the willingness of this administration to support the imposition of toxic ideas like critical race theory, intersectionality, and the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion must be seen as part of the reason why so many of our elites are indifferent to the post-October 7th surge in anti-Semitism. But it also helps explain a willingness on the part of the foreign policy establishment to assist in this American decline. For Jews, the captures of the institutions of higher learning, journalism, and so much else has led to the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism and hatred for Israel. But it is also key to understanding why so much of our governing and chattering classes no longer believe in the value of a strong America on the world stage, or even in the foundational principles of American exceptionalism that made it a unique safe haven for Jews. The events of the last 7 months have called into question not just the future of American Jewry, but also the future of American liberty, since it is incompatible with a worldview that believes that the United States is an irredeemably racist society, opposes the basic principles of liberal democracy, as well as believes that America and the West are fundamentally evil rather than a force for good. It is this basic divide, and not so much ignorance about the facts of the Middle East conflict, that is behind the protests on college campuses across the nation, as well as so many other problems. In truth, the question is not so much whether America will be a great power in the rest of the 21st century, but whether faith in liberal principles, democracy, and the West is still strong enough to save the nation from being completely taken over by the intersectional left. If not, not only will it no longer be a great power or a safe haven for Jews, but it will also no longer be the free republic that the founders envisioned. To discuss some of this and much else, we're fortunate to have back with us today one of the keenest thinkers and writers on these issues today. Seth Mandel is senior editor of Commentary Magazine, where he writes daily for the Commentary website, appears on its podcast, as well as writing for the monthly magazine. Previous to this, he was editor of the Washington Examiner magazine and op-ed page editor of the New York Post. Seth Mandel, welcome back to Top Story.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good to be back.
Well, it's great to have you with us, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us. I want to start by asking you about where we are in terms of the war that began 7 months ago. The October 7th attacks were definitely a pivotal moment in Israeli history, with the outcome not yet fully determined. But given the surge in American anti-Semitism and the willingness of so many of our governing elites and chattering classes to tolerate or even laud those chanting on behalf of Hamas, it could also be said to be a turning point in the history of American Jewry. So while the tent encampments on the campuses have folded up for the summer, do you think we fully understand the implications of what has happened both in the Middle East and, quite frankly, here in America?
I hope so. I mean, we've had enough time to process everything. We've had enough time to process what it all means and the reactions and what the reactions mean and what the reactions to the the backlash to the backlash. So we definitely have had enough time to fully understand what we're dealing with here. The main problem that we seem to be facing is that while the American Jewish community has been pretty good at facing the reality of what it all means, nobody else really is. So it has scrambled a lot of, mostly on the progressive side, mostly, on the left of center side, these alliances that people thought they had with organizations and their impressions of who they could lean on in times like this. They expected there to be a sort of net when they fell back, right? This is when you fall off the high wire and there's supposed to be a net there. And this was not, they didn't provide that net. And so I think the confusion is much less of people who are looking at this from the same perspective, from similar perspectives that you and I might have, which is that what Hamas did wasn't surprising. It wasn't surprising that progressive groups didn't stand by the Jews. It wasn't surprising that, they turned into a whole fight over DEI and things like that. I don't think that a lot of us were shocked, but I think that we're dealing with this as in terms of a whole community. There's, half the community is really shocked and sort of reeling from it. And so it takes time, that prevents us from solidifying what it means to the American Jewish community and, to have a single common definition or whatever of what happened. We have parts of our community who are still reeling, still trying to understand what's going on and what to do about it. And so for a community as a whole, we're not really there yet. We're still trying to figure it out. But I don't think that there's any more we need to know about Hamas's intentions, about Qatar's intentions, about Iran's intentions, about a lot of Israel critics' intentions here in the U.S., about the intentions of major media companies and major media figures. I think everybody has sort of put themselves out there and staked their place at the campuses, the faculties and administrations at these campuses. I think people have basically staked out where they're going to be. And so it's just a matter of everybody eventually coming around to accept the reality.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. Somebody that you and I have both written a lot about, Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL, A lot of what he said has been, exemplary. I mean, he seems to have gotten, the danger that, oh yes, this is his job, to worry about this stuff. But even within the ADL, I guess we can't resist a digression there. They're still on board for DEI, which I want to talk about a little later. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, even among those who have seemingly got it about the danger to American Jews right now.
I think so. I mean, we had mentioned Jonathan Greenblatt on the Commentary podcast yesterday because for the same reason, and John Podhoretz had given it as an example of the way things shift and the shifting of perspectives that happens to all political coalitions, and it's definitely happening now too. So yeah, and we've noted along the way, I think that what happened with the ADL is that they had bought so into the idea that was the end of history or the end of Jewish history, so to speak. The Anti-Defamation League had Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO, had surrounded himself with people who bought into the DEI worldview and the ideology behind it. And so when things shifted and Jonathan saw that things were shifting, he shifted his perspective along with it. I think that's clear now, it's undeniable that he did shift his perspective. But his organization was staffed by lots of people who had their own ideological incentives not to shift and not to recognize that a shift was necessary. And so I think that that's part of what we're seeing here, which is that organizations are more than just a figurehead. And so the Jewish community, organized Jewish community, to respond to something like this has to figure out if it needs to make changes. And I'm not saying you should go through and just start firing everybody, but I mean,
maybe they should.
Maybe they should. But I mean, I once suggested that the ADL should take its entire, whatever part of its budget it spends on DEI stuff and DEI staffers and all that stuff, and put it toward, security on campus or things like that, or advisors around major campuses, things like that. Have a presence in the major campuses in the major Jewish centers, of the country. There's a lot of schools with very high Jewish populations, and those are the schools where these protests seem to be loudest, and they're also the most easily reached. It's very easy, if you're the ADL, to get somebody set up in Morningside Heights. You don't have to wander into the Canadian Yukon here. So I think, and that's generally true of the city. So I think that these organizations do have to figure out if they're going to make structural changes. And if you look at UNC, University of North Carolina, is in the news this week because they apparently rerouted their DEI budget into hiring more university cops, which is like, a conservative's dream.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the sort of thing that, and I mean this really not even sarcastically, that Jewish organizations have to think about too. Why not think about, are your progressive ideological, spending items, maybe that needs to go towards security for the Jewish community. These are things that actually have to be considered. And I don't know if these organizations are ready and willing to go that far because it's a big step. And they have a constituency who still somehow believes in some of these things, especially DEI. The other thing I'd say about this that I find interesting is that if you're paying attention to the campus arguments today about whose free speech is being respected and whose free speech is not being respected, you're starting to hear a common complaint that colleges are using DEI structures to silence pro-Palestinian activists on campus.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the complaint that you hear now all of a sudden is that DEI pipelines and DEI structures and other such progressive wish list items, things that they really, really wanted and had no problem using, are silencing pro-Palestinian voices. And you're hearing this more and more. And people on the right and on the and among libertarians are saying, well, welcome to the party, pal. We've been saying this for 10 years. You created this doctrine that allows for limiting speech on campus, and eventually it was going to be applied to something you didn't want to be silenced. And, and here we are, that sort of thing. So it is a time for rethinking all of these things. And if these progressive groups that normally are very pro-DEI and related programs, if they're going to be rethinking some of this stuff, then how could the Jewish organizational community not also join them in that rethinking? That would be really something if the progressive political world went out farther than the Jewish organizational world in being willing to rethink and reconsider things like DEI.
Yeah, well, I don't really think they're reconsidering it. I think they're going to fight for it as much as they can. With respect to the Jewish community, part of the problem is that some of the Jewish chattering classes have not drawn any, Jonathan Greenblatt is to the right of everybody who writes with the Forward these days. And all the Jews who have influential positions on the New York Times, with, where the Peter Beinarts of the world have, much more access than you or I. So there are factors mitigating against that. So that's one thing. We can get into it. I want to ask, before I get into how we deal with DEI, I just want to touch on, you've written a lot recently about the dangers of radicalization. Do you agree that the capture of our institutions by woke ideology is at the heart of the problem on campus, as well as our discussions of Israel and much else? Because certainly as far as Israel and as far as anti-Semitism, the woke catechism grants a permission slip for anti-Semitism because they define Jews as white oppressors.
Absolutely.
That's a fundamental problem here.
And they would that's why Jews would never, some people say, well, Jews should just be added to the DEI script. But
right, that was like that petition in Hollywood.
Yeah, it can't happen. It can't, they're mutually exclusive. You understand that they have a setup, a worldview, and according to that worldview, Jews are part of this white American population, and that's that. I mean, you can go back to Baldwin writing in the 60s about this stuff, but this has been, Jews being identified with the sort of white majority is just the way things have been for a close to not quite 75 years, maybe. So, I mean, it's been a long time in America that this has been the way, especially it has been seen from the progressive standpoint, from the left political standpoint.
And the facts about the Middle East, the fact that, the Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel, and the majority of Israeli Jews, are not Ashkenazi. They're, by the definitions of the American left, they're people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East and North Africa. None of this matters because the ideology is sort of set in stone.
Right. If it mattered, you would see, it's exactly right. If it mattered, you would see it changing before your eyes. You wouldn't see Israeli professors who were born in the same town, maybe as Rashida Tlaib's parents, being treated the way they are on campus if, being born there means you're a person of color. So yeah, it's gone beyond that. It's baked into the ideology. It's solidified, it's concretized, whatever word you want to use to describe it. It's not moving. So yeah, I mean, and I think the ideological capture was basically all along surrender. It was like, well, all right, you guys, you want these trendy classes, so have a couple of colonialism classes, decolonization classes or whatever. Or, there's a popular academic or intellectual who the school can bring on and raise its stature. And that is enough to let them sort of teach whatever it is that they're going to teach. And it's this trendy thing. But then suddenly you look back and there's 300 courses on decolonization at, MIT or Harvard or Columbia or whatever, Dartmouth, any of these places. There's, I wrote about one the other day where it was like, if you just count the number of course offerings with colonization and decolonization, at places like Colombia, they have 100 choices in front of you. So what started as, a fine, like telling a kid, like, fine, have your lollipop. That's it. Okay, fine, have your lollipop. Just stop crying. We're out in public or something like that. And it's nothing but lollipops now. All they're taking in school is candy. It's all they're eating. And it's had the exact effect that you would expect. So schools are in this position of saying, I guess we could get rid of 2 decolonization classes or something, or add 1 on this, or, whatever. But it's a drop in the bucket. The whole point is that they created this educational structure built around an idea that inherently and unavoidably produces anti-Semitism. And that structure has to be changed if you want the culture on campus to change. You can't keep having everyone's favorite celebrity professors teaching them about the Jews being usurpers and then say, why does everybody seem so mad at the Jews all the time on campus? Can't everybody just get along? So I think that they surrendered to the students, and then they just sort of surrendered to their own ineptitude, surrendered to fate, and just they have no idea or are unwilling to do the amount of work that it would take to really reform these institutions. And at the congressional hearings, you heard discussion of this. There were members of Congress who, one member of Congress, a Democratic member of Congress, used to run the Jewish Federations of North America, and Kathy Manning, I believe. And she questioned the president of Harvard at one of them. She said to the president of Harvard, you know that the Jews are indigenous to Israel, right? Like, just between the two of us, that there's a long Jewish history there, that for 3,000 years the Jews have been there, right? I mean, and she was sort of agreed, whatever. And the congresswoman said, well, here's some of the courses at Harvard that you can take. And, she reads down a list of like all these things that show, that portray the Jews as colonizers and et cetera. And her point was that you, the president of the institution, don't believe this garbage, or you're embarrassed to believe it. So you won't admit in public that maybe you do believe it. Maybe you're crazy like them, but you're too embarrassed to admit it in front of Congress, and definitely in front of Elise Stefanik, that you believe it. So, obviously there's something wrong with it. There's something to be ashamed of in this. And yet, this is what your course offerings are like. This is what your institution is literally teaching people. Things you profess to believe are wrong historically. We're not talking about subjective things anymore. We're talking about, if you really don't know the relationship between the people of Israel and the land of Israel, or the Jews and Judea, this is like flat earth stuff. This is basic history. And it's a revising and a rewriting of, basic foundations of human knowledge. And that's what they're doing at Harvard. So, Kathy Manning's question to Claudine Gay's was basically, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? How can you, what are you thinking? What could you possibly be thinking? That's really what's behind these questions, is that you guys know all this stuff is garbage, and it's all you're teaching. And, I'll give just one other example that I always thought was a really good one, was the USC, was it USC that got in trouble for its valedictorian, then made the stupid decision of canceling her valedictory speech.
And then lying and saying it was before security reasons.
And then saying it was before security. I mean, literally every step of the way, they just mishandled this completely. But this student majored in something like biochemical engineering and minored in resistance to genocide studies or something like that. And her speech was going to be on the genocide stuff, obviously. They knew that. They knew what was coming. They knew the anti-Israel stuff was coming. But to me, it just showed you can take these kids and give them this body of knowledge in biochemical engineering or something like that, a hugely useful, from time immemorial, set of skills, and education and knowledge, right? And he'd say, oh, the valedictorian of our university is a 4.0 in biochemical engineering or something like that. Well, that makes a lot of sense. What's her speech going to be about? Well, about, how Israel's colonizers and, the moon goes around the sun and this and that. It's crazy. But they have taught people that the way to get noticed and the way to get by and the way to get ahead is to sideline the things that you know to be true and the useful knowledge that you have, and foreground total academic insanity that people outside the gates of this university would be shocked at.
Yeah, well, the disconnect there is enormous. I mean, in some, now of course that leads to a standard assumption that Israel and Zionism has lost the younger generation of Americans, whether that's an exaggeration or an accurate reflection of not just higher education, but what's happening on K-12 level is one issue. But in the end, we're left with what do we do about it? And I was very interested to see how much difficulty, people forget about the left, which is, they bought into the indoctrination. How many people on the right were so reluctant to support the Antisemitism Awareness Act, which sought basically to put teeth into the enforcement of Title VI on campuses, which basically say if you discriminate against Jews, we'll cut off your funding. And we had people like Chris Rufo, who is brilliant on DEI, saying, "Oh, but if you're saying you want to enforce laws against discrimination on anti-Semitism, you're just doing DEI too, rather than it's like this is unconstitutional." So, well, if that's unconstitutional, so is the Civil Rights Act as a whole. There was a lot of disconnect there.
Right. The complaint is about Title VI and this is there seemed to be this idea that the Department of Education was going now to go around arresting people as something. Wild ideas, but yeah, it was a modification of how to interpret an existing statute. So nothing was added, nothing new. Nobody has any new powers either. There was literally nothing new under the sun in that. It was really just and the other thing was that it showed that there's so much that people don't really understand, because Title VI, this was the crux of Title VI. The core of it is the race or national origin, right? That phrase, that idea, and discriminating based on race or national origin. So according to that, the anti-Zionism you see on campus is obviously part of it, right? In other words, this started because people in the federal government, the Bush administration, and following that the Obama administration, following that the Trump administration, this is a bipartisan thing. They were worried. They all saw the same problem, which is that if you attack somebody over their national origin, but you were wrong about their national origin, you may have found a loophole in it may not be a violation of their civil rights. And so for 2 decades now, the federal government has been trying to plug that hole in different ways.
Yeah,
and that's really all that is.
Even, the George W. Bush administration, even the Obama administration, Tom Perez, who went on to be the head of the DNC, he had signed off on it. And Trump, in his executive order had, and linked it to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And, you would think that would be a consensus. And you would think also that people who understand the threat from the universities, and that we have to, as Bill Jacobson said to me, it's not just that we have to change the universities, we have to protect society from the universities. And the only way to do it is the threat of defunding and actually using defunding.
The threat of defunding is certainly the only thing that really has that kind of power, sure, both from donors and from the federal government.
And it's more powerful than the donors because the federal government gives them more money than the donors do.
And anything the federal government does that, if the federal government looks like it's calling you, it's saying that you're in violation of the Civil Rights Act, just bad PR that universities don't want. So even your old donors don't do that, right? Bill Ackman criticizing you on Twitter doesn't have the same sort of public relations fiasco written all over it as if, hey, the Biden administration has to pull our funding because we're in violation of the Civil Rights Act. That sort of, so it makes that difference also. But, again, this is...
And the problem is nobody's, as much as there have been investigations, nobody's funding has been pulled yet. Right.
And they're trying to scare people, which makes sense. But it's going beyond college too. We've seen the Berkeley School District. This covers public education institutions, and public money going to educational institutions, not just college. But the problem with with seeing it as a kind of retaliatory speech restriction, this is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism guiding the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, is that the problem that we're seeing is not somebody said something mean, right? The big thing that happened early on in the college protests was an Israeli speaker was prevented from speaking on campus because people literally ransacked the building, smashed windows, someone put a Jewish woman in a chokehold, and they chased them out of the building and had to this is what we're talking about. It's not a problem of, if you're going to silence me, I'm going to silence you or something like that. The problem is that everybody should be able to have their speakers come to campus and not be physically assaulted. That's what this is supposed to be governing.
That's the hostile atmosphere.
That's the hostile atmosphere. And that's these were the triggers for pushing for, congressional action and things like that. Joe Biden himself, President Biden, expanded on Donald Trump's executive order that you mentioned before. At some point, I believe shortly after October 7th, or right around that time, he expanded that to apply to the other federal departments. So, for example, I don't think that housing discrimination is a big problem these days anymore for Jews. We're not being redlined these days. It's it takes a different form, but now that's in there too. So this is all a product of a bipartisan desire to make it clear what we mean when we say this word. And it's not dependent on speech. It's the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is everybody getting the same services? Are you excluding people from stuff? If you're excluding people from some sort of school program because of their race or national origin, you're not allowed to do that. And that's true even if you think they're dirty Zionists or whatever. That's you excluding them because you tie them to Israel is kind of a textbook violation of the national origin part of that phrase. So let him go through and go to class. He's got to be able to go to class. He's got to be able to go get his university meals at the cafeteria. These are things that people need to do. And the things that are being stopped are things that people are doing to them. Nobody says you're going to lose your funding if Jews can equally access the cafeteria, but they get called, somebody 3 tables away calls them a name while they're eating. We're talking about physical violence or physical intimidation, and we're talking about people being deprived of services that everybody else gets, and they're being deprived of those services because of race or national origin. It's textbook, and and that's basically the overall problem. And then you have the situation where people want to make everything speech, which is a different argument perhaps, or a different problem, but it is an element of this, where this idea that at some point along the way in the progressive world, speech became violence and violence became speech. And we're now dealing with that upside down world, and what it means that we have a swath of our population living in that upside down world.
Yeah, that's where we are. I would say also, listen, that the problem, is the woke capture of our institutions. Unless DEI is rolled back in one way or another, we're going to continue having these problems. But as important as the campuses are, part of the problem in the discussion of the current war is how it's being treated and reported in the mainstream corporate media. Why do you think so many people at the time, CNN and elsewhere, were so eager to be Hamas's stenographers in the wake of October 7th and even to this day?
I think that they've been living in the media ecosystem has a specific set of problems. And one of those problems is they have set themselves up into a world where as long as you can cite a reasonable sounding source or organization, you can just say anything about anybody. And so, well, this organization is called Human Rights Watch. I'm not saying it. I didn't say the Jews, drink the blood of Christian children and put it on their matzah at Passover. That was Human Rights Watch who said it. What do you want from me? There's a reputable organization. So there's this whole class of experts who aren't experts, right? I mean, again, expertise is a thing, and we value it greatly. But they've created a kind of fake studio set of expertise, and so they go to this guy goes from this organization to this organization, and they quote him here and he quotes him there, and they're basically just a bunch of friends who all talk to each other and like to call Israel names. And it's not that much more complicated than that. Unfortunately, Matti Friedman wrote a piece, several years ago where he talked about working for the wires, the AP, Reuters, and how you would basically parachute into a conflict and report on it, and then in a year be transferred to somewhere else. And this kind of tourism meant that you were totally reliant on these organizations we're talking about. You needed Human Rights Watch, or you needed the fixers that were available in Gaza. You couldn't do your job without them. And you didn't stay long enough to learn how to operate without them. You did not learn how to be independent and how to find this stuff out for yourself. You learned dependency for a year, and then you moved on to, covering Venezuela or something like that. And so these organizations, they have such power because they're just getting a sort of rotating core of these reporters in, and they're the ones who are the constants. They're the ones who are staying, who are there, and the media organizations see them as the natives, right? They see, Kenneth Roth at Human Rights Watch or whatever as the natives, not the Israelis, the natives. It's like Human Rights Watch country or whatever. And so I think that that's a real problem with the desire to just be able to cite someone to say what you're really thinking. And it ends up being totally editorialized and opinionated, but people just think it's okay as long as you can cite someone. And that's gotten totally out of control.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of the problem. Obviously, also sort of the woke capture of newsrooms, like the newsroom of the New York Times. We've seen that, how that works as well, because a new generation of young journalists, see themselves as activists, progressive activists more than journalists.
Yeah, I mean, that's for sure the case. And that's part of, it's almost as if they don't see themselves as different than the members of these organizations. But yeah, I think that you basically, you have people who operate in this world where they all act the same and write the same things, even though some of those people are technically reporters and some of those people are senior fellows at the whatever, at the, super great international conflict resolution organization, whatever. And they all sort of say the same things. And if you switch those people, if you switched them at their jobs, right, you traded places, you would get the same things written at the Human Rights Organization and the same things written in, say, the Washington Post, where that reporter, where you moved him from. The people are all, the pieces on the board are almost interchangeable, and they seem to really want it that way. They seem to want it to be a situation where you have limited power as an individual reporter anyway to make any sort of shift in this, that there's a set narrative, there's a set background, there's like a green screen, right? They want you reporting against a green screen. They're going to project onto the green screen when that airs what they want to project. And anything you say is going to be up against the background on the green screen that they choose. But you're standing in front of an empty wall. And I think that that's just the problem with pretty much every major organization, media organization, both here, and in Britain, the BBC and places like that. Sky News kind of went off the rails, this conflict too. It felt like a race to the bottom. So it's not just an American thing, but I think it's a Western thing, this idea that you should just be, that you should just be replaceable pieces on a chessboard. And the people in the offices will decide how what you're describing will actually be read and seen and heard and understood by either readers or viewers, depending on, what media you're in.
Yeah, well, I think the media is a huge problem. But let's turn away just from strictly the campus of the media. But I've been struck by the complete inability of what, for lack of a better term, we have to call the foreign policy establishment in this country, both the apparatchiks in the State Department, young and old, as well as people like Thomas Friedman, to draw any conclusions from not just October 7th, but basically anything that has happened in the Middle East since 1993. I mean, one example, I just read Victoria Nuland, who is a senior State Department official through a number of administrations, including, the George W. Bush. I mean, she, worked on a lot of things, is more responsible than anyone for our Ukraine policy through several administrations. And in her exit interview, because she's failing upwards to go be a professor at Columbia, the way people on the left are so good at failing upwards, even though she doesn't consider herself, somebody on the left. And they asked her about, the Middle East and the war in October 7th, and she just said, well, we have to stop Israel from believing that it can defeat Hamas, and we have to just basically use this as an opening to create a Palestinian state. And as if it was, August 1993, and, the Oslo Accords had not yet been signed, and everything that we have learned since then, it brings to mind, frankly, that one of Donald Trump's virtues was his complete distrust of these people. And yet somehow they're still running things in Washington and will, let's be frank, if Biden is reelected, continue to mismanage American foreign policy. What's your explanation for their persistent hold on power?
Well, I think that, not to take it back to the academies, but the academies are part of the pipeline, right? And so I think that there's a whole pipeline there. But in terms of Trump, there was a real chance for a wake-up call on this front, because they said to Trump, if you move the embassy to Jerusalem, the whole place is going to be lit on fire. You're going to have an intifada. You're going to have this, right? And he said, I don't think so. But anyway, it's the right thing to do. I've been convinced. I have I've got my advisors here.
Well, if you read David Friedman's book, I mean, the discussion in the room was like, Friedman said, well, if you're really Donald Trump, right. If you're the authentic Donald Trump, you're not going to listen to these people.
Right. And essentially, it's the heckler's veto problem, which is what you hear a lot. But all throughout, the establishment tends to say this stuff all the time. Well, we don't want to disrupt things. We don't want to upset the balance, etc. Donald Trump came in and said, I bet if I do this, it won't upset the balance. And it didn't. And then he said, I'm gonna recognize the Golan Heights, and nothing got set on fire, and we're going to have agreements with Sunni Arab states that don't include the Palestinians, that don't have a sidetrack for the Palestinian negotiations, and everything didn't blow up. So I think that there was this sense that the people who are normally hair on fire types had there was a chance to reassess everything related to this. There was a chance to say, well, every time they say things will explode if you do this, in any situation and in any context, maybe we should question it, right? I mean, not even just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but wait a second here. Maybe the world isn't actually a tinderbox, with a spark always about to fly out of your ear. Maybe the world doesn't blow up with every move that isn't, part of some sort of establishment worldview. And that could have been far and wide, applied far and wide. And it was a bit to the Balkans too with Rich Grenell. So there was a bit more to it than just the Middle East, but the Middle East was where it was most pronounced in the Trump administration, where people just said, this thing is the right thing to do. People say don't do it because bad people will get violent if you do the right thing. And you had Donald Trump, of all people, saying, I'm not going to let the bad, violent people stop me from doing the right thing. It's like, who should normally be saying that sort of stuff? You do not expect there to be some sort of, conscience, a foreign policy situation. Not that he is, but just that, it was a funny situation to see Trump saying, well, I don't care if bad people do bad things. I can't, be bullied away from doing the right thing. And a lot of it had to do with which advisors he was listening to and who was convincing him. I mean, it was a lot more than just his worldview, but it was that general suspicion of we don't do this because we don't do this. This is not what we do, and we haven't been doing this, and therefore we don't do this. It's what my father's always called Soviet logic. The idea that this is policy. That's why we're not doing it, because it's policy. Well, you're just telling me you don't do it. But you're not giving me a reason you're not explaining why. You're not convincing me that on the merits, this is a bad idea. You're just afraid of stepping off the path or doing something different. And that is something that Trump used to his advantage to accomplish things. And I was hoping that it would cause, and I'm not talking about a reassessment of I'm not saying banish everybody who's ever had an opinion on this or that, off of the op-ed pages, but just a sort of simple, I guess we need to question specifically when we're told not to do something because we don't do it. We should ask for more in that situation.
And it's a set of beliefs, it's a sort of like, the belief the Palestinian statehood, just to seize, one shibboleth, is like a religious belief.
Yeah.
That will solve the problem. And so, as I said, Victoria Nuland is like reciting that now, and it's sort of like, you haven't paid it, you're supposed to be the smart people, but you haven't paid attention to a single thing that has happened in that region for 30 years, and yet you're still supposedly the expert. And now
the best version of this was Elliot Abrams years ago. Elliot Abrams was interviewed by the Jerusalem Post, and he said, this was, I think, after he came out of the Bush administration, or maybe while he was still there, but Elliot said, we're always told with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that everybody knows what the solution will look like. Everybody knows what the end state will be. It's just a matter of getting there. And so Elliot said, well, if it's gone on for decades and everybody the parties involved keep saying no, maybe we don't know how this will end. Maybe we don't know the end state. This assumption that, well, we all know where we're heading. It's going to be, this along, the 67 lines with some swaps and this and that. And, this neighborhood's going to be here and they'll have a road to this neighborhood, whatever. We just need to get them to say yes. And it's like, there's obviously something more fundamental going on here, especially with the opposition of the Palestinians who did not keep coming back with counter offers. They just said no. And so that was, I always try to keep that in mind, that maybe we don't know how this is going to look and how this is supposed to end. And that assumption, I think, gets us in a lot of trouble all over the world with the foreign policy community. And it's just basic assumptions like that I think you can learn to question and not live by. And it will open up a world of knowledge for the people making these assumptions too. Old habits die hard, but if you are able to stop yourself from saying, well, everybody knows how, India and Pakistan are going to resolve Kashmir, then you will find yourself making progress in places that you didn't before. And so I was hoping that it would cause, that kind of, the Enlightenment.
Right, but there is no enlightenment.
It's sort of like, everybody opens their eyes and ears and it didn't, because
quite the contrary.
Quite the contrary, right. The negative partisanship, as we call it, is so strong that something is bad because the other guy or the other side does it, and we've trapped ourselves in that mindset. But we're seeing it again now. The people who said you can't move the embassy, you can't do it, right? Well, they're back on MSNBC and writing op-eds in the Times and the Washington Post, telling everybody what the end state of this conflict is going to look. Well, everybody knows that you can't defeat an idea with military power. You can't kill an idea. Everybody knows this. So you can't defeat Hamas, and it's like, they're sort of back at it with, even with the same fundamental assumptions about the world that reveal themselves to basically be slogans. These are, academic slogans. It sounds snappy to say, you can't kill an idea. You can't shoot an idea.
But of course you can kill an idea.
You can kill Yahya Sinwar.
Yes.
Right?
Listen,
and no matter what ideas he has in his head, like, come back to earth, please. And it hasn't. And you watch the political talk shows and you read the newspapers and you're seeing what looks like the 4 years of the Trump experimentation, which in some places went very well, in some places went very poorly. None of that happened. It's like you skipped the record. The needle skipped over 4 years, and we act like it's just continuously always been this way. And I think that says a lot, that there's been these opportunities to change the way we think and to adjust our worldview, and we haven't taken them. And I think for the superpower, the leader of the free world, the responsibilities that America has, this is about more than just those specific issues. This is a sort of closing of the American mind type of problem that is going to be a curse on us for generations. It's going to be an albatross around our neck for generations, because we can't seem to shake off the refusal to question assumptions.
Yeah. Well, what you said just a moment ago brought to mind something that is particularly frustrating for me right now, because I think, had, the brakes not been put on Israel, and if it had been able to sort of, in an expeditious manner, take out Hamas completely and devastate it, and the world would have been okay with, and with the world's approval, I think there was a chance for a sea change in Palestinian opinion, just as there was a sea change in German opinion, in 1945, when they saw what had happened when they'd been completely defeated and their cities turned to rubble. But they're not being forced to question their assumptions and give up their fantasies. All these demonstrations and all the dithering in the American political class about whether they should be allowed to be defeated has completely thrown away this, what I think was a unique chance to change the mindset of the Middle East. Maybe it wouldn't have happened anyway, but now there's no chance, because everybody, they're all being told by people in the West, no, you're right, hold on to your fantasies of destroying Israel.
Right. That's how Hamas, that's how they fattened up Hamas leaders with Qatari money. Right. The spigots didn't turn off. So why should they? If you're in the West, if you're a Palestinian in the West Bank and you're a member of the Fatah party, or you believe in the Palestinian Authority's legitimacy, and what you need to see in Gaza is Hamas losing because of its refusal to compromise. right? That's the
I think
only
it goes
thing that can
beyond even-
convince you to compromise with the Israelis. But you're not going to compromise with the Israelis if Hamas is going to be rewarded for beheading the Israelis.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a certain
And I think it even goes beyond, Fatah apparatchiks. It's ordinary Palestinians have to be convinced of this as well, because if ordinary Palestinians if they didn't think that their people would turn on them, then all of Abbas's people would be doing the right thing. So that's actually my segue to a question about President Biden. And you've been writing a lot about his difficulties in articulating a consistent stand on the war against Hamas. And quite frankly, he's been talking out of both sides of his mouth since October 7th, both supporting Israel in its war against Hamas, but also repeating false charges about its conduct of the war, appeasing his left-wing base, and now flirting with an arms cutoff. What's your explanation? If you're a Biden whisperer, explain to me and our audience what's going on with him.
I tried to explain in a blog post during the course of this war that the thing it most reminds me of is there's an old Danny Kaye movie, The Court Jester, where he plays a character who is an imposter of a hero, of a sort of heroic Robin Hood type, and he gets hypnotized, and when he hears fingers snapping, he goes back to whichever personality he wasn't in. Either he's the swashbuckling Robin Hood type who can, win a sword fight with one hand tied behind his back and looking the other way, or he's an imposter and knows he's a fool and he's a court jester and behaves as such. And with Biden, you were getting this sort of, there's a scene toward the end of the movie where he's in a sword fight with one of the, major bad guys, and somebody keeps snapping. Sometimes it's him, right? Danny Kaye's character, he'll say, he'll snap to punctuate something he's saying, and he'll go like this, and he'll have hypnotized himself out of it. And that's what it feels like we're seeing. It feels like we're watching Joe Biden snap every 3 minutes, snap his fingers, and return to a completely different previous person. And one of those people is victory is what matters. The West has to win. And one of those people is, I'm already alleviating all these kids' student loans, and they're already getting angry again, and I mean, they're diametrically opposed political personalities. One is, I've been doing this for 8,000 years, and I've never changed. I've changed my mind on some things, yes, but I've never changed on some of these basic, fundamental ideas that you find the center of gravity and you make it hold, right? That was Biden. That's who I am. Find the center and make it hold.
Yeah, a political weather. Another way of saying it is that he was a political weather vane.
Without question. But he had a way but the way he did it would have prevented that Joe Biden for years from doing things that are broadly unpopular. And siding with Hamas is broadly unpopular. And the student loans thing was a real fight uphill. He's adding things, he just picked another culture war fight the other day over Title IX and transgender bathrooms and things like that. He's doing things now that have never been part of his persona, because his persona has always been, I want to make sure that I have pillows on both sides of me that I can lean on. And now he's just kind of reckless. With reckless abandon, he's running around going, what do you want? What do you want for your vote? You want a Title IX thing about bathrooms and who can use them? Fine. You can have a Title IX thing about bathrooms and who can use it. We get into some of these ridiculous things. When he ran in 2020, he was the get off Twitter guy. He said that to Donald Trump at the debate, get off Twitter. And I remember cheering when he said that, because we all should get off. And, no offense to, I'm on Twitter all day, but I just, I know that it's
we're on social media because that's our job.
Right. Right. But, he's right that the president of the United States should get off Twitter. Right. And then he takes office, and it seems to me like Ron Klain, his chief of staff at the time, is just scrolling Twitter all day and retweeting people who say nice things about Biden all day. And it's like, 6 months ago, you won the election because you were the guy who said, get off Twitter. Stop running the White House according to Twitter. That's what the New York Times editorial room does. The New York Times runs its editorial position through Twitter. The president of the United States and the leader of the free world doesn't. And Biden said that clearly, and everybody thought he understood it, and he won the election. And then almost immediately it changed. And he's, and you can see how unmoored you become when you pay such close attention to these sort of granular social media fights, because you saw it with Trump too. Like, Trump was also all over the place. He had this sort of scatterbrained way of looking at things, and it was often, just these synapses firing according to what Twitter was saying, and today versus yesterday. And you can see how it very easily can unmoor a politician or an administration from anything solid. It's like being out on a canoe, instead of at the dock. It's like you're just kind of drifting. And that's how Biden has been. And so you can see how it's not that anything he does is governed by Twitter. It's that the mindset is, let's see what's out there, right? Let's go out there, see, like Ed Koch, how am I doing? Sort of thing. Like, let's go ask everybody. He just doesn't seem to have any sort of set propeller that's just, this is the speed we're going at, this is the direction we're going, and this is when we'll get there, right? And he's your navigator now who doesn't seem to be looking at a screen. He's just wandering around the deck.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly, I think you make a good point about social media and, the way it has of deranging us. But I think there's a specific problem with Biden because it's the Democratic Party that has changed. It's sort of Democrats don't have sister soldier moments anymore, where Bill Clinton, showed that he was credible by being willing to take on radicals because, the Democratic Party has shifted to the left. The problem with Ron Klain and, when Biden took over the White House is that the left had the whip hand over that administration from the beginning, because that's where they perceived, the center of gravity within their party to be. And it's sort of axiomatic that Biden may be the last pro-Israel Democratic president. And he may not even be so it's arguable that he's not pro-Israel so much anymore. But where does the Democratic Party go? There are some progressive, moderates left, but the progressives certainly seem to be the future of the party. That's where all the energy of the Democrats are. And it's really distorting American politics and American policy.
Yeah, it is. And even when they're in the minority opinion, again, these polls have shown since October, Biden supporting Israel over Hamas is not going to cost him Michigan. There's just never been a poll that suggested otherwise. All the numbers and all the polls and all the surveys have been very clear. That's not what's going to cost him Michigan. But he seems to think it is. And so, then he would send these delegations out to Dearborn, to the leaders of the Arab American community, and he would do all this...
To bend the knee to the pro-Hamas
do all this
mayor
diplomacy,
Dearborn.
like he was visiting, Riyadh or something. And it was, you thought he was going to... I thought he was going to add a cabinet-level ambassador to Michigan or something like that, or to Detroit after that. He seemed so worried, but he was consumed by it. The numbers have never said it. So it really is distorting policy, because what you have is a vocal, semi-violent minority getting policy made according to what they want over the wishes of the majority in a democracy. And that cannot be healthy. I understand that not everything is majority rule, obviously, but what you're seeing now is if they get violent enough and occupy enough buildings on campus and things like that, they can get the policy that they want, even though nobody else agrees with them. And that's obviously just a terrible precedent to set, because whoever comes after Joe Biden in the Democratic Party is not going to want to say no to them. Biden wants to say no to them at least some of the time. He wants to be able to say, I'm saying no to them. Kamala Harris doesn't want to say no to them. She doesn't have a persona built around, sometimes I say no to the children. And he's the last guy who has a persona built around, sometimes I say no to the children, and you can't get everything that you want, and that's that. And everybody coming after is going to just leave the door open. Come on in, write the legislation yourself. Everybody's on the same page. It's like when public unions and governors get together to write, legislation on this to do collective bargaining. It's like nobody whose money it is sitting at the table. That's how it's going to be with progressives having so much influence, is that the majority are not going to be sitting at the table. You're going to have a fringe and the person who's just going to do what the fringe wants them to do at the table. And that's not really healthy, and that's not really a debate, but that feels like where we're headed.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem. There's so much more I would have liked to have gotten into about the election and Trump. We'll have to have you back a little later in the year to evaluate where we are then. Seth, thanks so much for coming on and for all of your insights. You can follow Seth's work at commentary.com and on X, where he is, as he says all day, at Seth A. Mandel. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.